Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto went through puberty again. Our heroes did not come from a future where everything has gone horribly wrong. They did not travel back in time to save the world from a bleak or miserable fate. As a matter of fact, all they want to do is find a way back home as soon as possible. Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 5, Giggles and Garbage. Hinata Uzumaki ne Hyuga dearly loved her family. This statement was not exclusive to her husband and children, or even to just those members of the Hyuga clan who had been kind to her as a child. Family was family. Even the most distant relatives on her husband's side were as dear to her as siblings. Karen Hozuki ne Uzumaki was like a sister-in-law to Hinata, and she was as close to the woman as she was to her own sister. Karui Akimichi was practically a cousin. The daughter of Priestess Shion was like a niece. The Hyuga family tree was very closely knit, even for all of the bad blood between its branches. Hinata was accustomed through long use to reckoning even far-flung relations as kin, as the Hyuga clan, for how large as it was, kept among its own as often as not. The fact that her husband's clan had all but disintegrated and scattered to the four corners of the earth decades ago did not deter Hinata from warmly greeting even his most distantly removed relatives as family. She was a kind, warm-hearted, understanding sort of woman. Even though her childhood had not always been the happiest or most fortunate, she firmly believed in family before all else. This was why she could greet someone like the Hoshikage as Nisama, just because the man's mother had carried a few drops of Uzumaki blood within her veins. Hinata loved her family dearly. This statement did not exclude her father. Oh, he had been a hard man, a stern disciplinarian who would not hesitate to berate her for even the slightest mistakes while training. Hayashi Hyuga had never been a terribly expressive individual, and had rarely shown any kind of recognizable affection to his children in their youth. A less forgiving woman than Hinata would not hesitate to begrudge the man his harsh training and critical attitude. But Hinata loved him all the same. Hayashi was her father, and not a bad person. As a parent herself, she could now understand the anxiety and the worry, the fear of not being ready to raise a child. She had faced many of the pitfalls herself, been forced to overcome numerous tribulations as a mother of two. Her father had never hated her. No, it had been a very long time indeed since Hinata had feared as much. He loved both of his daughters, and wanted only the best for them. As the head of a ninja clan, that meant doing everything he could to make his girls strong, to impart upon them the resolve necessary to someday lead the family, and fighting ability to keep them alive. Hinata did not resent her father for calling her weak as a child, or for pushing her so hard to improve. Those words had hurt, of course, and the stress had driven her to withdraw further and further into herself, but she knew that he had been doing no different for her than his father had done for him and his brother. If anything, Hayashi's methods had been lenient by the standards of traditional shinobi discipline. He had never struck her outside of a spar, or pushed her too far past her limits. He was not an outwardly affectionate man, but neither had he ever been abusive. When it had become seemingly clear to him that Hinata would likely never be able to completely discard her kind nature, or to overcome her hesitation and self-doubt, he had simply given up and turned his attentions to the more promising Hanabi. This may have dismayed Hinata when she was young, but the person she was now could understand his reasoning. She did not resent the man, or begrudge him that long-past dismissal of her potential. Hinata Uzumaki was a mature, grown woman. She had overcome those insecurities many years ago. She and her father had reconciled when she was still in her teens, and now she was 35 years old, a mother of two academy students. With a husband like Naruto Uzumaki, it was only natural that Hinata would have long since come to terms with her childhood. Although she was now in a 12-year-old body, back when her father's antipathy towards her had been at its peak, from Hinata's perspective she had been at peace with the man for almost 20 years. She loved her father dearly, and respected him as well. This did not mean, however, that she could not find amusement in his present fear of her. Honestly, the whole misunderstanding was actually pretty funny from her perspective. The look on his face when he saw her returning to the manor had nearly made Hinata break out in laughter. Even now, a quarter of an hour later, she could still feel one or two giggles escape her lips as she thought about her father clinging to Dojo's outside wall like the ground had turned into lava. Hayashi hadn't even looked that undignified at his 50th birthday party, when one of his older cousins had cracked out some less than flattering baby pictures of the retired clan head. Heh, hee, sneerk. Kiba Inuzuka stared at his female teammate with an odd mixture of confusion and anxiety. Hinata's face was quite a deep shade of red, and her shoulders appeared to be spasming on and off. She looked rather like she was having trouble breathing, too, and was clutching uncharacteristically at her ribs. You alright, Hinata? He ventured, looking uncertainly at the girl. Teehee, ha ha ha, why yes, I'm fine, hee hee hee. Kikiba, kun. Shino, from the other side of Hinata, looked askance at the girl. Possibly. He might have also been staring at their new Jonin-sensei's behind. The sunglasses made it kind of hard to tell where his eyes were actually pointed. If I didn't know any better, I would say it almost sounds like she's laughing, the Aburame commented. Laughing? Kiba frowned, narrowing his eyes and looking more closely at Hinata's scarlet face and trembling frame. Huh. Weird. Is that normal for her? He looked curiously at Shino, perhaps expecting the insect user to have a better insight into their female teammate's personality. Kiba had honestly never actually noticed either of them until yesterday, when they'd been stuck on a genin squad together. Those two were not the kind of people who stood out from the crowd. Shino might have frowned at Kiba's question. It was hard to tell. Not that I know of, he said. It seems to be quite uncharacteristic of her, actually. Kiba furrowed his brow. He scratched his head. So? He muttered. What? Has she snapped or something? For some unfathomable reason, Hinata's laughter seemed to redouble at this comment. Kiba stared at the girl, uncertain what to think. Akamaru rode on the boy's head, the small white pup eagerly wagging its tail. Hinata shook her head, red-faced and trembling. No, I'm so sorry. She giggled a little more, tears in her eyes. It's nothing, Kiba-kun, Shino-kun. It's just. I just remembered a very funny joke. That's all. Shino seemed to accept this. Kiba cocked an eyebrow suspiciously for a moment, before shrugging and letting it go. He could buy that. I see. Must be one hell of a joke, he commented, stretching boredly. Hinata's lips twitched. Oh, it is. It really is, she said. There was a twinkle of mirth in her eye. A moment of silence passed between the trio of genin, as they followed Kurenai to the mission center. Kiba watched the clouds go by, and Shino stared fixedly at a point a little ways in front of Hinata, who walked directly behind their new sensei. They walked down the street to their destination, the building rearing up ahead of them. Ninja of various ranks came to and fro around them as they drew near to the tower. Shino hummed thoughtfully. I wonder what kind of mission we'll be assigned. He spoke up, glancing around as they passed in through the door. Kiba let out a barking laugh, and grinned at his male teammate. They'll probably want us to infiltrate some kind of smuggling ring, he confidently declared. Oh. Or maybe we'll be assigned to guard a princess. A beat. PFFFFFT. Hinata's face turned an impossible shade of maroon, and her cheeks puffed out. Wide-eyed and shaking, her mouth snapped open, a howling laughter escaping her lips. Ha 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 ha. Oh goodness. Ah ha 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 ha. Kiba and Shino both stared at Hinata. Quietly, they scooted a couple inches away, unsure how to take this newest hysterical fit. Kurenai, for her part, was glad that none of the three noticed her own trembling lip, or the tears in her eyes. She herself was only barely restraining her laughter. It took Hinata several seconds to calm down, and several ninja in the mission center, mostly those acquainted with Hyuga clan members, were giving her very wary looks. Shino and Kiba continued to stare uncomprehendingly at the girl. Well, okay, that was mostly Kiba. Shino was still keeping his eye on Kurenai-sensei, for the most part. The Chunin at the desk got a wicked gleam in his eye when Team 8 walked up to him. Ah, he said, glancing at the look of scarcely suppressed amusement on Kurenai's face, and the trio of fresh-looking genin behind her. Your first mission. Despite herself, Kurenai couldn't help mirroring the man's sadistic grin. Hinata was breathing slow and deep to keep herself from breaking down in giggles again. She felt most unusually giddy, and a part of her wondered if it might not have had something to do with the 12-year-old body she was currently inhabiting. Kiba and Shino were more concerned with the contents of the scroll the clerical nin handed their sensei. Even the fairly stoic Abu Ramel looked a hair eager for their first official job as shinobi of the Hidden Leaf. "Well? What's our mission, sensei?" Kiba asked excitedly. "Infiltration? Assassination? Bodyguard duty?" Kurenai turned to face her students, an all too innocently sweet smile on her face. "Babysitting," she told them, a trace of sadistic delight in her tone. Oh, she was going to relish this. If only she had a camera to preserve the looks on their faces for posterity. Kiba blinked. His face twisted in disbelief and confusion. He looked one part offended, one part irritated, and one part constipated. Even Shino seemed to wilt a fraction of inch. Hinata beamed, however, the only one of the three to not only look unperturbed by this announcement, but even appear to be downright pleased with their assignment. "Oh, good," the girl warmly chirped. "That should be fun." They passed. Hiruzen Sarutobi, the Lord Third Hokage, looked up from his calligraphy. Smoke curled from his pipe in thin wisps, the slender, finely crafted instrument shifting between the elderly shinobi's lips. Kakashi Hatake was standing just outside the threshold of Hiruzen's study, looking oddly pleased despite the ragged state of his uniform. The Sandaime was mildly surprised to note what looked like numerous claw marks in the Jounin's flak vest, as well as a few larger rips and tears. Hiruzen narrowed his eyes thoughtfully, plucking his pipe from his mouth. He exhaled a puff of sweetly pungent smoke, frown lines subtly deepening. "Did they, now?" he murmured, voice low and raspy. "I must admit, that is a pleasant surprise. Irika seemed quite certain you would fail them." A strange expression flickered over Kakashi's face for the briefest instant. Less perceptive men wouldn't have even noticed it. "Irika, huh? I think I remember him," Kakashi said, his visible eye marginally narrowing. "Their academy instructor, right?" "Correct," Hiruzen said with a curt nod. "I do believe you're the one who convinced him to make that particular career choice." "Was I, now?" Kakashi mused. "Well, I don't remember it, but I suppose it could have happened." He shrugged. "Honestly, though, if that guy was actually worried about those three failing my test." He trailed off. Hiruzen noticed a curious mixture of resentment and gratitude in the copy ninja's voice. "I'll admit that their team combination is a potentially volatile one," he conceded, "but clearly they managed to pull through spectacularly." Kakashi gave Hiruzen an eye smile. "Oh, no. Not just pull through," he said. He shook his head, looking almost torn between swelling pride and petty resentment. "I dare say those three completely demolished me. I wasn't able to even lay a finger on them." The Sandaime blinked, and stared at Kakashi. After a moment's silence, he frowned. "I beg your pardon." "You heard me, Lord Hokage. They tore me into pieces and completely trivialized the bell test. I didn't even have to tie one of them to a log." Here, Kakashi paused. "Not that I would have been able to unless they let me, I imagine." Hiruzen snuffed out his pipe, and he set it aside. "Kakashi," he said slowly, giving the man a gimlet eye. "Have you been indulging in any recreational habits I should be aware of? Maybe they aren't immediately poisonous, but there's still a reason that those mushrooms are labeled as highly toxic in the field manual." Kakashi shook his head. "I assure you, Hokage-sama," he said sincerely, "I have not been engaging in the use of any non-prescription opiates, narcotics, or psychotropic substances." Hiruzen's eyes were still narrowed. "And yet you were unable to so much as lay a finger on three freshly graduated academy students." He drawled. The skepticism was dripping from his tone. "Perhaps you need to be sent back for remedial lessons, yourself, Kakashi." Kakashi, again, shook his head. "No, no. You wouldn't be saying that if you'd seen them in action," he insisted, a strange look in his eye. He glanced pointedly at the Lord Third's crystal ball. Hiruzen cleared his throat, inconspicuously dabbing a bit of blood away from his nostrils as he recalled a certain impromptu spar that had erupted between Anko and Yojeo in the hot springs earlier that day. Yes, well, he muttered. They must have set up quite a good number of traps for you in the length of time it took for you to arrive, I do not doubt. He gave Kakashi a pointed look, silently reiterating a well-worn lecture on the distinction between tolerance and approval in regards to the man's customary cunctation. But Kakashi dismissed it with a wave of his hand. The only trap they've set on me since I met the three was that eraser Naruto dropped on my head the other day. I don't know what Iruka's been teaching those kids, but the only one of them whose abilities didn't completely baffle me was Naruto. Kakashi paused. Although I do wonder how a minor could come to have such an intimate knowledge regarding the Icha series and its heroines. Hiruzen sighed, getting the impression that they were getting back into somewhat more familiar ground. I see, he muttered. So it was that harem jutsu of Naruto's that did you in. Kakashi's smile seemed especially genuine at this comment. The boy has a real talent, he said sincerely. The perverted giggle slipping from the man's mouth, and the visible pinkness in his cheek, only slightly ruined the effect of his words. Hiruzen once more dabbed at his nose, closing his eyes and trying not to think about the singularly well-endowed female love interests in his favorite student's most famous series, all clad in nothing but thin wisps of smoke, and lewdly squirming and cooing as they piled on top of him and the Sandaimo's cheeks darkened noticeably. The tissue in his hand became stained with red. Yes, of course, he said distractedly, before weakly shaking his head and discarding the blood-drenched tissue. Well, yes, ahem. He cleared his throat. What about the other two, then? He inquired, trying to change the topic to something less likely to violently exsanguinate him with certain associated mental images. Kakashi paused, frowning. Well, Sakura leveled a good portion of the forest surrounding the training grounds. She's like a freak mini Tsunade, he said with a barely repressed shudder. A moment later, he added, almost as an afterthought, oh, and also Sasuke seems to have awakened some strange kind of Sharingan. The Lord Third blinked. A frown tugged at his lips. Define strange, Kakashi. It didn't have a tomo pattern, Kakashi elaborated. It looked like, well, I don't know how I'd describe it. It was sort of like. He gestured vaguely. Do you know those spyglass sort of toys? The ones with the dials and the twisting shapes that don't actually show what you're looking at. Kakashi scowled, visibly racking his brain for the word. It's, well, like, it looked sort of like that, or at least the pattern reminded me of something you might see in one of those. He tapped a finger on his wrist, fidgeting as he tried to recall the word. You know, it was like. Hiruzen narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. He stroked his short beard. Like a kaleidoscope. He said, venturing a guess. Kakashi blinked. He snapped his fingers. Yes, that's the word. He said, nodding his head. Yes. It was like a kaleidoscope, except in only red and black. Do you know anything about that? The Sandaime nodded. That does sound familiar, he said. The Lord Second, my mentor and predecessor, did extensive research into the Sharingan during the latter part of his life. I might have some of his old papers still lying around somewhere in my personal library. He gestured for Kakashi to leave, before pausing and getting a thoughtful look. Is there anything else you might need to tell me? Kakashi paused halfway out the door, a thoughtful expression on his face. Well, Sasuke is missing an arm, he commented. Says he fell down the stairs. Hiruzen blinked. Then he let out a sigh, and rubbed the bridge of his nose. How troublesome, the professor muttered. Yeah. Tell me about it, Kakashi agreed. Somewhere in the village, Shikamaru Nara sneezed. Man, 12-year-old me was such a slob. Naruto looked around at his apartment, shaking his head. It was an absolute pigsty. Sasuke and Sakura stood behind the blonde, to either side. Both looked around at the apartment, really taking in the messy, filthy state of their friend and teammates' living quarters. Right. Like you aren't still one, Sasuke drawled, rolling his eyes. He smirked at Naruto. The blonde scoffed in response, shooting a dark look back over his shoulder. Bah! What do you know? He grumbled. Sakura looked around appraisingly. She and Sasuke had been in here earlier, of course, but she hadn't really taken the time to take a good look around until now. She gave a weak shrug, and a lopsided half-smile. I don't know. She murmured. I wouldn't say it's that bad. Naruto scratched the back of his neck, and he gave Sakura a sort of grateful look. You think so? He said. I mean, I know I was just a kid living on my own. Yeah, it's not that bad, Sakura repeated, saying it with a touch less conviction. Sasuke snorted. I've seen landfills with less garbage, he scoffed, wrinkling his nose. Please tell me you plan on tidying up in here, Naruto. The blonde shrugged. Maybe if I have time, he said, waving a hand dismissively. But I was kinda busy sending out those letters, earlier. You know. Yes, unfortunately, Sasuke muttered. He grimaced at the sight of a half-empty cup ramen sitting amongst wrinkled, dirty tissues. Sakura frowned, placing a hand on her husband's shoulder. Now, dear, she said, her tone gently remonstrating. Be polite. That was as much your idea as Naruto's. I know, Sasuke sighed, rolling his eyes. Honestly, woman, between you and our honorable Lord Hokage, it's a wonder I've managed to stay sane all these years. That's assuming an awful lot. Naruto guffawed, elbowing his friend in the ribs. Like you aren't already completely cracked. He waggled his eyebrows teasingly. Sasuke looked like he was an inch away from pouting. Bastard, he sniped, but there was no real heat behind the word. Sakura smiled indulgently, and wrapped an arm around Sasuke's waist. Naruto chuckled, and cleared away a spot on his couch. Garbage and old scrolls were heaped onto the coffee table, and one of the legs was propped up on a stack of ancient, yellowing newspapers. This place could really use a woman's touch, the pinkette observed absent-mindedly. Maybe Hinata could help you tidy up. It's like the bachelor pad from hell, Sasuke agreed. Naruto shrugged, before letting himself plop down on the couch. I was a total slob as a kid, he conceded. But it's not like I'll be inviting people over for dinner parties, or anything. A sock chose that moment to wriggle its way out from under a stack of ramen cups. Stale and crusty, more brown than white, the article of clothing started crawling off the coffee table. Gurgling hideously, the vile thing flopped onto the floor with an audible grunt. Naruto pinned it down with a lazily flung kunai, not even looking in the sock's direction as he continued chatting with his teammates. Sasuke and Sakura spared a mildly disturbed glance toward the still writhing garment. The blood-curdling screams were rather disconcerting. Naruto, Sasuke said, looking slightly sick. Please. Clean your damn apartment. Sakura nodded weakly in agreement. Yeah. I think we'd all rather avoid a repeat of the boxer shorts rebellion, she concurred. Or the curdled milk revolt, Sasuke added, his eyes glinting with something like amusement. Sakura smiled crookedly. Oh, yes, she said. And of course, who can forget the moldy toast assassination plot? Heavens forbid we have another stalking strike, Sasuke said seriously. Or a mutant cockroach insurgents, Sakura spoke. Ugh, that was horrible, Sasuke said with a shudder. Don't even remind me. He made a face. Sakura nodded sagely, and gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. Don't worry, Han. I'm sure we'll be able to cut it off before it starts, she said. If it looks like the roaches are about to achieve sentience and assimilate the power of chakra from Naruto's garbage. The seventh Hokage made a very rude gesture. Assholes, Naruto grumbled, sounding distinctly petulant. I am so assigning you each a month of D-ranks when we get back home. Sasuke and Sakura smiled, and whistled innocently. Omaka. You are hereby cordially invited to an Uzumaki family reunion in the Hidden Leaf Village. As a surviving descendant of the Uzumaki clan, your presence at this event would be greatly appreciated. There will be refreshments, of course, and plenty of festivities. The date has not yet been set, but please RSVP as soon as possible. A second letter will be sent to you when we have finalized the arrangements. Please send your reply to the following address. Karen blinked. She turned the scroll over in her hands several times. A recently acquired Kyuzagaku forehead protector was lying across her lap. She frowned, glancing nervously at her teammates. The two older genin seemed unconcerned with the young redhead, busy amusing themselves by poking and prodding at the messily eviscerated corpse of the delivery ninja who had brought her this message. With only a very faint grimace, Karen turned and started fishing through her things for a brush and scroll. She was curious, to be honest. And who knew? Maybe she'd actually meet a cute guy over there. Karen blushed at the thought, and let out the slightest perverted giggle. Karui of Kumogakuer took one look at the contents of her letter, before swearing loudly and vehemently. 1/4. She snapped at the parchment in her hand. 1 Mizai-quarter. Amwa and Samui watched their teammate curse at the scroll with expressions of mild worry. Is this about that whole Uzumaki thing? The former wondered. Must be, Samui replied blandly. What else would she be shouting? 1/4, over. Huh. I wonder what's in that letter, then. Amwa murmured. If it's got Karui in such a tizzy. Samui eyed their red-headed teammate, who angrily spared one last glare for the scroll in her hand, before tossing it over her shoulder. Amwa didn't quite manage to duck in time, and he fell backwards over the black and blue form of the unfortunate delivery ninja. Anoka Uzumaki nodded politely to the delivery ninja, smiling as she absent-mindedly restrained one of the more temperamental test subjects with a relatively basic A-rank sealing jutsu. She glanced down at the scroll the courier had passed off to her. It looked to be a message of some sort, and the wax seal was unbroken. There was a mild fuinjutsu bound to it, one she expected would only open for a specific criteria. Casually pricking her thumb, Anoka dripped a bit of her blood onto the wax seal, which promptly glowed for a second, before melting away into nothing. Unfurling the scroll, she began to read. The contents of the letter surprised her, and she barely even noticed when one of her employer's most recent attempts at creating the ultimate summoned beast broke free from its restraints just long enough to snap up the departing courier ninja in its jaws. Humming thoughtfully, Anoka started looking for her writing supplies. Konan stood silent and expressionless beside the deva path of her lord and comrade. He held a scroll in his hand, one which she had already checked quite thoroughly for traps. Pain read the message contained within. His face was unreadable. Several long minutes of silence passed between them. Is this some manner of joke? He muttered at last, lowering the scroll. He glared sternly at the delivery ninja. Despite the fact that he was being suspended in midair well over a dozen stories from the closely packed streets below, tightly wrapped in a cocoon of explosive notes, the messenger seemed quite unfazed as he politely shook his head. Pain scowled, and stowed the letter away in the depths of his cloak. Dispose of him, Konan, he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. His angel dutifully nodded, and moments later the citizens of Omegakuer found themselves cheering on an impromptu fireworks display. You are hereby cordially invited to an Uchiha family reunion in the Hidden Leaf Village. As a surviving descendant of the Uchiha clan, or unrelated bearer of the Sharingan, your presence at this event would be greatly appreciated. There will be refreshments, of course, and plenty of festivities. The date has not yet been set, but please RSVP as soon as possible. A second letter will be sent to you when we have finalized the arrangements. Please send your reply to the following address. Kakashi blinked, nearly running straight into the delivery ninja who had been standing outside the Sandaime's office. He intelligently said, still a bit distracted from the talk he'd just had with the Hokage. A letter for Kakashi Hatake, the courier said, the very picture of professionalism. He presented a scroll from the depths of his mail pouch, and Kakashi accepted it with an owlish blink. The copy ninja dismissed the messenger with a bored wave of his hand, ignoring the slightly put-off look on the man's face, and cracked the scroll open as he made his way out of the tower. Taking note of the Uchiha clan seal in the wax, Kakashi flicked his eye over the letter's contents. It looked like complete gibberish. Without missing a beat, he uncovered his Sharingan. Ah! A family reunion. He drawled skeptically, seeing that he could now read the letter. A moment passed, and he shrugged. Well, I suppose it could be good therapy for the kid. Danzo stood secure and cautious behind a high-level barrier jutsu as one of his more disposable agents tested the scroll for traps. A delivery ninja stood off to one side, bound in straps and drooling a little as a mind jutsu expert scoured the man's brain for any and all intelligence on the Foundation. Danzo waited patiently as his agent slowly and carefully broke the seal on the scroll. He leaned on his cane, a stony expression on his face. "Well?" he rasped, his voice coming out more like a growl than anything else. "It appears to be encrypted," the agent replied blandly, toneless. "Judging by the pattern, I'd say it's probably meant to be read with some manner of jujitsu." Danzo scowled, and after a moment's thought beckoned for the scroll to be brought over to him. Lowering the barrier and uncovering the Sharingan he had quote-unquote acquired from Shisui Uchiha, the head of the Foundation irritably snatched the letter out of his soldier's hand. If it were possible, his expression became even stonier when he actually read it. Itachi Uchiha hummed thoughtfully as he read the letter in his hands. His brow was subtly furrowed, and a flicker of some unreadable emotion passed over his face. "Foolish little brother," he murmured. "Have you forgotten already?" Kisame glanced curiously at his partner, who was staring holes into that illegible mess of text on the scroll the delivery ninja had handed him. "Is it anything important, Itachi-san?" he inquired politely. "Maybe," Itachi answered, sounding pensive. "It seems I have been invited to a family reunion." Kisame quirked an eyebrow at this. "I thought you killed all your family," he quipped. Itachi shrugged in silent reply, and handed a modest roll of bills to the courierman, who bowed gratefully before departing. Tobi's eye twitched. He looked from the scroll in his hands to the violently dismembered remains of the delivery ninja who'd had the gall to address him by that name which he had discarded so many years ago. He looked back down at the letter, which was addressed to one Obito Uchiha. Had he possessed an eye with the Anton affinity, the sheer force of his glare would have already komused the poor scroll into tongues of pitch-black flame. He looked back at the delivery ninja, whom he had so brutally torn apart upon the first mention of that hated name. He felt a heat in his chest, and a pressure behind his eyes. His gut roiled furiously, filled with bile and wrath. Lifting his mask, Tobi spat fire at the mutilated corpse. Then, for good measure, he undid the zipper on his trousers and emptied his bladder on the ashes. The letter itself he tore into a number of very tiny pieces. Chapter 6, The Land of Waves, Life is Hell. "Welcome home, dear. How was your mission?" This was the first thing Naruto heard upon passing the Chunin Gate guards. It was a fine, sunny day that saw Team 7's return from their first official C rank, and Hinata smiled cheerfully as her beloved walked back into the village. "The mission went about as well as you could expect," Naruto said with a shrug. "It turned into an A rank before we were even a day's walk from the village, of course. You know how that kind of thing goes." Hinata nodded, and fell in step alongside Naruto as the blonde and his team made their way into the village. Sasuke and Sakura nodded at the girl in acknowledgement, politely greeting her with a wave or a smile. Kakashi didn't outwardly respond to Hinata's presence. He had his nose buried in a careworn copy of Icha-Icha Paradise, and probably wouldn't have noticed it if the entire village burst into flames all around him. Naruto smiled at the girl, though, an easy grin quirking his lips. Hinata returned the smile in her own demure fashion, quietly confident in her poise and expression. "I see," she said thoughtfully. "Are you okay?" "I am all right," Naruto answered, assuaging her concern with a wave of his hand. "Wasn't anything we couldn't handle." "That's good," Hinata commented. "I'd hate to see you or your teammates injured on your first real mission." Naruto gave her a sly grin, and puffed out his chest. "Nonsense, Hinata-chan. Every mission we take is important to the village. No matter what a job might be ranked as, it is imperative that we take it seriously. To do anything less would be an insult to our pride as shinobi, and to the trust of the Hokage." Hinata giggled, and patted him on the shoulder. "Yes, dear. Of course, dear," she said, responding in an absent-minded, smile and nod sort of fashion. "Whatever you say." Naruto repaid this comment with a blink and you miss it peck on the cheek, and a similarly quick pat on the rear. "You know what I mean, sweetie," he spoke, winking cheerfully. "Every little bit counts, and the village depends on the revenue we bring in with our missions." Hinata giggled, and retaliated by snatching her husband's hand and twining their fingers tightly together. "You tease," she said, her eyes glinting with amusement. She winked at him. "Don't start something you can't finish." Naruto pouted. "Even if I still can't do it reliably," he muttered, before shaking his head. "Well, that's beside the point. I've got good news." Hinata delicately arched a slim, lavender eyebrow. "Oh? And what would that be?" she inquired carefully. The mission was a success. The way he said mission made it clear to her that he meant something quite apart from any job sanctioned by the Honorable Sandaime. She smiled cautiously, an unreadable expression flitting momentarily across her face. "Ah," she murmured. "That's good." Inari and the other villagers stared, slack-jawed, at the sight of Gato's very few remaining men turning tail to flee. The vast majority of the mercenaries were laid out cold at the far end of the bridge, looking surprisingly unharmed despite their present state of unconsciousness. The young wave native who had done his darndest to rally his dispirited countrymen weakly lowered his crossbow, blinking owlishly. Kakashi and Zabuza looked pretty beat up. The latter appeared quite sheepish as someone who was either a very pretty girl or an extremely pretty boy tended to an assortment of minor injuries. Sakura herself had a pair of shadow clones attending to her Jonin-sensei, and the third one of her was healing some pretty gnarly stab wounds on the Kiri swordsman's arms. Sasuke waved to Inari in languid greeting with his one arm, the ground around him littered with a veritable haystack of gleaming acupuncture needles, as well as a very large puddle. The older boy didn't look like he had a single scratch on him, or even one hair out of place. And at the far end of the bridge, where the few conscious mercenaries left were flinging themselves over the edge to escape retribution at the hands of the ramshackle wave militia, a seemingly unfazed Naruto was patting a distraught and sobbing Gato on the shoulder. Notably, the tyrannical businessman's nose was bent at an odd angle, and he looked to have the makings of a nasty shiner around one eye. There, the blonde was saying, speaking in a soothing tone. "We all make mistakes. But the important thing is knowing when to admit you've done wrong. I just wanted you to love me, Papa." The ruthless shipping magnate wailed. "I never meant to hurt all those people." He buried his face in his hands, a very loud and miserable-sounding sob tearing from his throat. Inari, and the several score of concerned wave citizens backing him up, blinked in unison. The effect was somewhere between comical and creepy. You could actually hear their eyelids sorta wetly clapping shut, before sliding back apart in perfect synchronization. "The hell did we miss?" Inari gaped. Hinata met Naruto's eye, and he nodded seriously. She smiled, tilting her head in silent acknowledgement of the unspoken message. He squeezed her hand, and leaned in for another quick and silent ninja kiss. A slightest pink flush worked its way up from the nape of Hinata's neck, her cheeks subtly coloring. Her smile became playfully lopsided, and she gently shoved her husband. "Ha ha ha." Naruto laughed, bright and sunny. It is. Kakashi looked up from his book to eye the pair a hint curiously. He shook his head, sighing in what sounded like amused exasperation. "Man, kids these days," he muttered to himself. "Hard to believe they're already pairing off." There was a touch of something nostalgic in the man's tone, a whisper of happy recollection untainted by the bitterer memories of bloodshed and tears. He glanced from Naruto and Hinata, who seemed to be competing to see who could express their affections the most stealthily as they walked down Main Street, to Sasuke and Sakura, who sounded like they were in the middle of bickering like an old married couple. "Honestly, sweetie, just admit you thought he was cute, already," the pinkette said to the last loyal Uchiha, a twinkle of something Kakashi would rather not psychoanalyze in her eyes. "I did not," Sasuke retorted stubbornly, hand tucked peevishly into his pocket. He was slouching and scowling, a slight scowl on his face. "How many times do I have to tell you I'm not into that kind of thing?" Sakura giggled and gave him a pat on the back. Now. She sing-songed. "It's nothing to be ashamed of. He wore that yukata very well, after all." Sasuke's cheeks reddened, and he looked away from Sakura. "Sure, okay. Yeah," he muttered peevishly. "It did look good on him, I'll admit that much. If he'd been a girl, I might have even thought he was cute." He gave Sakura a sharp look. "But he wasn't. So I didn't." Hmm. Whatever you have to tell yourself, Sakura said, smirking wryly. Personally, I'd say he was absolutely adorable. You and your Shotokan, Sasuke huffed. Honestly, woman. Sakura rolled her eyes. Prude, she teased, blowing a raspberry. Then she winked. Or maybe I should say hypocrite, she added, smirking. 'Cause I'm pretty sure I saw you checking out Tsunami-sans. That's completely different, Sasuke cut in, speaking remarkably loftily. Briefly shooting a glance at Kakashi, he lowered his voice to say, she's much closer to our actual age, for one thing. Sakura snorted. And the fact that you and I are an item isn't enough to convince you not to stare at her ass. She jibed, though there was no actual heat in her words. Oh, please. Like it kept you from eyeing Zabuza's package, Sasuke retorted, rolling his eyes. Sakura shrugged. What can I say? She replied. I have a thing for younger men. He's not what I'd call handsome, though, Sasuke said. Or are you into that whole no eyebrows thing? And what would you call handsome? Sakura teased, latching onto the first part of his statement. Honey. Sasuke blushed. It wasn't immediately obvious, but it was there. He coughed, clearing his throat. Haku, he conceded, seeing that his wife had brought their topic full circle. Quickly, face reddening further, he added, you know, since most girls seem to like their men to be on the more effeminate side. He is a total bishi, Sakura conceded, nodding sagely. Though I'd say I've mostly outgrown that phase. Plus his face is just a bit too girly for my tastes. She winked at Sasuke, and grabbed his hand. No way in hell is that a man, Sasuke hissed to Naruto, watching Haku leave the clearing. Men do not shake their hips like that. Clearly you've never seen Sai at a dance club, Naruto drawled, watching Haku go. Besides, which of us apprenticed under the biggest straight pervert in the elemental nations? I know a woman when I see one. Haku is not a man, Sasuke insisted vehemently. She's obviously just a very flat-chested girl. Naruto rolled his eyes. Keep telling yourself that, bud. If you want to believe that Haku is just a pet Anko who likes to go around lying about her gender. She is, Sasuke spoke, a steely look in his eyes. And if you so much as breathe a whisper to the contrary, I will punch you so hard. Naruto snorted, a smirk tilting his lips. Whatever helps you sleep at night, he chirped. Then he waggled his eyebrows. But in all seriousness, Haku does have a very nice ass. Yeah, fair enough, Sasuke conceded, a faint flush to his cheeks. That never happened, Naruto, Sasuke ground out, glaring at the blonde. Naruto smirked mischievously. Maybe, he said evasively. But you can't definitively prove a negative statement, so there's always a chance that you actually were ogling Haku's butt. Sasuke glared. His face was red as a beet. Sakura giggled, amusedly side-eyeing her husband. Hinata smiled, her eyes twinkling with interest. Kakashi turned a page in his icha-icha. I hate you so much right now, Sasuke muttered darkly. Naruto laughed, waving a hand dismissively. Sure, whatever you say, he said. I don't think there's anything wrong with you appreciating certain parts of this Haku-san's anatomy, Hinata added comfortingly, patting Sasuke on the shoulder of his missing arm. Sakura nodded eagerly. And if you decided to appreciate them in a more hands-on manner. She added with a playful wink, preferably while I'm watching. The pinkette waggled her eyebrows suggestively. Sasuke grimaced at this, and looked dearly like he wanted to continue defending his heterosexuality. Instead, after a moment of visible indecision he spat out a exceptionally vehement curse against Naruto, Haku, and the whole damn world in general. Kakashi turned another page in his icha-icha. Chapter 7, Stalkers and Spies. Tsunade was not having the best day. Or week. Or month. In fact, pretty much the whole past several years had just been one big mess. Aside from the gambling losses, and massive debts, and sleepless nights filled with dreams of blood and failure, she also had to deal with people coming to her and asking for her services. And not those kinds of services, mind you, she was called the legendary sucker solely for the fact that she never knew when to quit, when it came to gambling. But she was also a legendary medic, almost universally considered to be the best healer in the world. So there were lots of people who wanted her to take a look at their sickly or injured loved ones. And for the most part, these were the otherwise hopeless cases who had nothing left to lose, the sort of people who thought, well, if Tsunade can't do it, no one can. This wouldn't be so bad, of course, if the only folk requesting her aid were wealthy, affluent types who could pay handsomely for her trouble. Sure, there was that crippling hemophobia she had to work around, but that's what she had Shizune for. But unfortunately, a disproportionate number of the people who sought Tsunade out were desperate charity cases. And it never failed to make her feel like a total heel when she turned those sorts away, but she also knew that she couldn't just go around treating people for free. She needed every red cent just to scrape by from one day to the next. She wouldn't dirty her hands for free. She couldn't afford to. And yet, she would do 100 pro bono jobs in a heartbeat, if only it meant never having to go back to the leaf again. Even after all these years, her sensei refused to give up on trying to convince her to return. Tsunade let out an exasperated sigh, leaning against a good-sized boulder as she stared up at the clouds. Fluffy, meandering drifts of water vapor, white cotton wisps floating across a blue backdrop. Her eyes, brown and weary, flicked side to side as she stared listlessly at the sky. That one looks like a toad. She gazed at a particularly lumpy cumulus, trailing banks like outstretched legs behind it. The resemblance was faint, and academically Tsunade understood that it was just a quirk of the brain's image visual recognition processes, that the cloud didn't really bear objective similarity to any sort of amphibian. Yet, all the same, her thoughts turned unbidden to Jiraiya, whom she had both consciously and unconsciously associated with toads for nearly as long as she'd known the man. Tsunade felt a weight in her chest, and her eyelids seemed painfully heavy. She stared silently at the sky, feeling unusually introspective. Normally she would be gambling at this time of day, or traveling from one town to another, or even doing some kind of favor for one of her debtors to make them let up a bit of the pressure. But the nearest town was still a few days away, and no one was hounding her for money at the moment. And besides that, Shizune wasn't looking all that good today. It was that time of the month for the younger woman, and even with her level of medical ninjutsu there was only so much that could be done without access to certain herbs or pharmaceuticals. And Tsunade had lost even more money at the last town than usual, so much so that they'd been forced to choose between food or medicine. Shizune was a real trooper, of course, and would have gladly soldiered on through the discomfort, but Tsunade felt sympathetic to the girl, and even if Shizune was a mature woman and Jounin level kunoichi much closer in age to 30 than 13, she would probably always think of her as a girl, and had suggested they take a break. Although she didn't show it outright, Tsunade could tell that Shizune was grateful. They were resting a short ways off the road, now, maybe 3 or so yards. Tsunade was reclining against a small boulder, and the girl who could have been her niece was down by the stream, splashing her face with cool water. Judging by the position of the sun overhead, and the length of time for which they'd been walking, it was probably late noon. Maybe around 1 or 2 o'clock. Tsunade glanced towards her apprentice and traveling companion, who was gently coaxing Taunton to take a drink while they were stopped. It wasn't a particularly large stream, just 4 feet across and maybe 2.5 foot deep, but nonetheless the diminutive pig looked distinctly mistrustful of the burbling water. As Shizune continued patting and urging her pet/summon to take a sip, Tsunade looked down in her lap, shifting against the rock and feeling the scroll in her coat pocket. It pressed into her side, and she felt a twinge of ill humor at the reminder of its presence. She scowled. You are hereby cordially invited to an Uzumaki family reunion in the Hidden Leaf Village. As a surviving descendant of the Uzumaki clan, your presence at this event would be greatly appreciated. The letter's contents replayed themselves through her mind, like the words of a particularly pushy salesman who lacked the good sense to take no for an answer. Uzumaki? That's rich, Tsunade muttered darkly, wondering ruefully if she didn't still have a half-full bottle of sake somewhere amongst her possessions. Please. Like I'd ever actually fall for such a transparent ploy. She shook her head, staring blearily at the grass between her legs. You'll need to do a hell of a lot better than that if you want to lure me back to the village, Sarutobi-sensei. Down by the stream, Shizune let out a startled yelp as a testy, mulish Tauntaun splashed her clothes with a considerable volume of rather chilly water. Ack. No, bad. Bad Tauntaun. The woman squeaked. Bad. Tsunade pinched the bridge of her nose. Ugh. I need a blasted drink, she sighed. Kiba ducked out of sight when he saw Team 7 approaching with Hinata in tow. He gently wrapped a hand around Akamaru's muzzle, silently hushing the pup. Concealed behind a pile of crates, the Inyazuka cautiously peeked out from a gap between the boxes. His eyes were narrowed, and his lips described a perplexed frown. He stared suspiciously at Naruto, who was holding Hinata's hand, chatting and smiling with the girl like he didn't have a care in the world. Kiba fought the urge to growl. Shino had said he was being ridiculous to get so worked up over Hinata hanging out with the members of another team. Kiba, in frustrated retaliation, had snapped, "Your face is ridiculous." It only took Kurenye-sensei a few seconds to pull her two male genin off of each other, but the lecture she'd then given them about maturity and cooperation and all that crap ate up nearly half an hour of their training time. This left both boys very irked indeed. And in Kiba's opinion, Naruto and his teammates were obviously the ones to blame for that. After all, if it weren't for how odd Naruto and Sasuke had been acting recently, he wouldn't have felt the need to get so worked up over how much time Hinata was spending with them in between training and missions. And if he wasn't so obsessive about figuring out what the hell was up with Team 7, he wouldn't have been getting on Shino's nerves with his fidgeting and muttered suspicions. So, yeah. As far as he was concerned, that whole lecture was all Naruto's fault. Sasuke's, too. He gave Sakura a pass because she was a girl, and he didn't know her all that well from the academy anyways, so he wasn't actually sure how much of her behavior recently could actually be considered unusual. Kiba glared at Naruto from behind what he thought was perfect cover. And in all fairness, it was pretty good stealth for a ninja as inexperienced as himself. Sneaky enough to fool most other rookie genin without any problem. Of course, none of those five were rookie anything. Kakashi could smell the boy, and hear him crouching behind the boxes. Sasuke and Sakura detected him instinctively, getting the gut feeling that someone was watching them, and quickly deducing who it was and where they were hidden. Hinata, although her Jujutsu was not properly active, still had very sharp sight. She'd spotted Kiba before he even saw them coming. And Naruto, as a sensory-type ninja whose skills were beyond even being called Kage level, was aware of every single person in the village. Kiba might as well have been standing 3 inches from the blonde's face, for all the good his hiding spot did him. So all 5 members of this group were in fact perfectly conscious of Kiba spying on them. Kakashi noticed that his students, and Hinata, noticed, and each of the 4 reluctant time travelers were intuitively aware of the other's awareness. Naruto, not sensing any malice greater than a mild curiosity with the tiniest dash of petty envy, gave Sasuke a look that told the Uchiha to stand down right as he was considering whether to call out their apparent stalker. Sasuke scowled infinitesimally at this, but then gave a dismissive half-shrug. Sakura smiled, meeting Sasuke's eyes, and nodded in unspoken understanding. Hinata clasped Naruto's hand, squeezing it gently. Kakashi pondered what to do for dinner. Kiba, being only an inexperienced rookie genin, albeit a reasonably talented one, did not realize that he'd been spotted. Thus, he continued to tail Team 7, plus Hinata, for several more minutes. They went on up the street, and Kiba slipped stealthily out from behind the crates, skulking along after them. He scurried from one cover to the next, zigzagging across the road, zipping behind street lamps and stalls. Kakashi parted ways with his team after 2 more blocks, waving distractedly to Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura, and telling them to take the rest of the week off. From what Kiba could gather, apparently their last mission had been a higher rank than expected, and there was a lot of paperwork Kakashi would need to go through before his genin could take another job. I don't see what the big deal is. Sasuke's voice drifted down to Kiba, the Inyazuka listening raptly to Team 7's conversation. It was just an A rank, after all, and not even a particularly difficult one. Kiba shared a perplexed look with Akamaru at this statement. An A rank? Nah, that couldn't be. Sasuke was probably just taking the mickey. Sure, the Uchiha hadn't exactly been known for his sense of humor back in the academy, but Kiba had noticed through his reconnaissance, "Shut up, Shino," It's not stalking. That Sasuke had, after graduation, apparently cultivated a certain dry, sarcastic wit. So this was probably some kind of weird, team-in joke. Kiba's thoughts were then interrupted by a snatch of speech from Sakura. Yeah, sensei, not a single scratch between the three of us. Maybe next time. Actual challenge. Akamaru fidgeted next to Kiba. Team 7 was moving outside their range of hearing. Kiba nodded, and darted up across the street. He ducked behind a barrel not 3 feet behind Kakashi, and was once more close enough to hear what his marks were saying. The paperwork will take a while, regardless. You sure you don't want our help with the mission report, Kakashi-sensei? More hands make for lighter burdens, after all. But too many cooks spoil the broth, Naruto. Kakashi-sensei has already offered to do that for us. Right. And besides, I doubt Kakashi would trust us anywhere near a mission report form after that Tora fiasco. Naruto sighed, and shook his head. He, Sakura, Sasuke, and Hinata came to a stop while Kakashi continued onward. Team 7's Jonin-sensei did not tarry, and was soon well out of sight. It was an honest accident, the blonde said, looking mildly peevish. Really, just because the old man wound up having to redact like 3/4 of the report when he finally sent that copy over to Umbu Archives. Sakura rolled her eyes. It was a D-rank mission, Naruto. How you managed to get the details of the report classified as an S-rank secret is beyond me. Hinata let out a giggle. Ah, yes, I remember hearing about that, it's what caused that recent diplomatic incident with Cloud, right? Kiba blinked, not sure how to take this remark. Sasuke, in contrast, snorted and rolled his eyes. You should have known better than to try and borrow chakra from the nib. Yujito-san, correct. Hinata interjected, shooting Sasuke an oddly stern look. Yes, she was with the delegation that came to the village. I overheard as much from father. A strange expression flickered across Sasuke's face. He gave a start, before reddening and nodding. Yeah, right. That's what I meant. Somehow or other, Kiba got the opposite impression, but honestly, he couldn't make heads or tails of what they were saying. The individual words made sense, but something about the way they were being strung together simply refused to parse. Sasuke gave Naruto an odd look, after saying this, and the blonde scratched the back of his neck sheepishly. To be fair, I'd thought Tora might react better to a more feline chakra. But clearly you were mistaken, Sakura commented. She smirked. Naruto blushed. Right. Yeah, fair enough. He gave a shrug. And, honestly, it had completely slipped my mind that Yujito would still. It was a pain in the ass trying to explain that whole mess to the Lord Third, Sasuke sighed, shaking his head. I don't think he even bought our explanation. Hinata smiled. What was it, again? She mused, a twinkle in her eye. I do recall that Naruto told me, but the exact details seem to have slipped my mind. Sakura gave Hinata a curious look. There was something Kiba couldn't read in the pink's eyes, and for the briefest moment he thought he saw her glancing toward his hiding spot. But the next moment she was looking back at Hinata, and didn't seem to give any noticeable sign that she had seen him. Kiba let out a relieved sigh. He didn't catch what Sakura said next, though. She lowered her voice and leaned in toward Hinata, cupping a hand over her mouth to stymie any would-be lip readers. Whatever Sakura said, though, it must have been very amusing, because Hinata suddenly let out a clear and mirthful laugh. Oh my! You don't say! She tittered, pearl-scent eyes merrily twinkling. Oh, my! She shook her head, smiling playfully at Naruto. The blonde blushed when Hinata's gaze fell on him, and he scratched the back of his neck. What can I say? He mumbled, sounding a touch sheepish. I was grasping at straws with that one, I'm just thankful Yujito-chan didn't bother to contradict me. Sasuke smirked. I dare say she wouldn't have been able, whether she wanted to or not. He drawled. His eyes gleamed. What with how hard she was laughing? Naruto responded with a mildly rude gesture. Oh, shove off, he sniped. Or should I tell Sakura about those magazines you had me hide for you the other day? Sasuke went red in the face. I told you, he grumbled. They weren't mine. I found them in a box of Itachi's old things. Naruto smirked. Oh ho ho. He drawled, grinning like the cat that caught the canary. So you and Obito weren't the only Uchiha to have a nurse fetish? Sasuke's eye twitched, and he leaned into his something Kiba couldn't quite catch. All he was able to make out were just because something medic ninja and something, doesn't even count, anyways. Hinata smiled knowingly at this, and glanced sidelong at Naruto, who mirrored her expression. Are you sure, Sasuke? Said the Hyuga heiress. Because I seem to recall hearing about a certain anniversary dinner. Sasuke's face went redder than any tomato, and he immediately wheeled on Sakura with an expression on his face that Kiba might have described as something almost like betrayal. You told Hinata. He yelped. Sakura shook her head, smiling softly. Don't look at me, dear, she told him. I wasn't the one who blabbed. Sasuke frowned. He seemed to calm down marginally at this, though he still looked a touch mortified. Was it Shizune? He muttered. Hana, Sakura said. After it was over, I guess she was really drunk, and went off and blabbed too. Once again, it seemed for a split second like Sakura was looking straight at Kiba. But then her eyes were back on Sasuke, and she was talking like she hadn't seen anything. Kiba wondered slightly at this comment about his sister getting drunk. Hana wasn't actually of age yet, and she usually seemed to be very stringent about following the rules. He spent a few seconds mentally debating whether to file this remark away as potential blackmail material on his big sis. He also wondered what his older sister would know about Sasuke and Sakura, but shrugged it off a moment later as something he didn't particularly care about. Well, I'm sure you can guess who, Sakura finished. Sasuke scowled, implying that, yes, he could guess who. Remind to kick that bastard's ass the next time we see him, he muttered. Onyx's eyes flashed. Sakura smiled indulgently, and nodded her head. Sure. Whatever you say, dear. She patted him on the shoulder. Kabuto Yakushi frowned as he looked over the most recent intelligence he'd gathered within the village. Coded documents written in a cipher that only 3 people alive could read appeared on his desk in a puff of smoke, called up from within a small black storage scroll. His bedroom was nothing special. It was not especially tidy, but not quite messy, either. It was a small, cozy affair in a cheap, modest flat. Perfectly ordinary and unremarkable, nothing that would lead someone to suspect its tenant as being anything unusual. Kabuto's desk lamp shined a sickly yellow light over his coded documents. Papers rustled as he shuffled them, flipping through the intelligence reports. Kabuto was a firm believer in checking his work. Dark eyes swiveled left and right, skimming the contents of the documents he had compiled over the last few weeks. Kabuto was a very good spy, and rarely ever let something escape his attention. There was no such thing as a superfluous detail in his opinion. Even if it didn't seem immediately important, you could never know when an apparently small matter might wind up proving paramount. It had already been decided that he would meet up with one of Lord Orochimaru's agents during his next mission outside the village. Tentative plans had been drawn up for infiltrating Konoha during the next Chunin exams, and while there was nothing concrete yet, it was nonetheless crucial that Kabuto gather as much information as possible. Scientia potentia est. That was Orochimaru's motto, and Kabuto believed in it strongly. The intelligence he would be passing along to the hidden sound was worth his weight in gold, and it would be inexcusably remiss of him to hand along anything faulty or suspect. Knowledge was power, and power corrupted. And Kabuto was one of the best dem spies alive. He knew better than to trust anyone completely. Even Orochimaru. Especially Orochimaru. Glancing again at a paper which described a private meeting between the Sandaime Hokage and Kakashi Hatake, the transcript of a conversation regarding one young Sasuke's apparent activation of the rare and potent Mangekyo Sharingan, Kabuto hummed thoughtfully. The glare from his lamp's light rendered the young man's spectacles nearly opaque from the right angle. The corner of his lip twitched up in something distantly like a smirk. Separating this paper from the others, Kabuto crumpled it up and tossed it into his wastebasket. Fractions of a second later, he deftly and disinterestedly smothered the resultant fire with a flame-retardant blanket. He then glanced at a closely related form, one which contained an encoded copy of a certain medical report regarding young Sasuke and his missing arm. It took only a moment for the spy to decide his next course of action. Grabbing his pen, Kabuto added a few notes to subtly emphasize the possible ramifications of Sasuke's dismemberment, particularly in regards to his combat ability, and certain top-secret plans that Orochimaru had been devising for the lad. Then he flicked through a few more papers, coming eventually to a report on the so-called Hinata massacre. The Hyuga clan had hushed the incident up pretty quickly, but not before Kabuto had learned everything he needed to know. With a flourish of his pen, Kabuto added a few notes on the Byakugan's potential usefulness, inconspicuously commenting on the apparent level of skill which young Hinata had demonstrated. He then smiled to himself, capping his pen after a few minutes of writing, and nodded in satisfaction with his work. Setting that aside, Kabuto proceeded to check the rest of his reports. It would not do to send Orochimaru-sama any faulty or misleading intelligence, after all. Can you believe that girl? Ino hissed, seething in her usual seat at Yakiniku-Q. Choji sat next to the platinum blonde, inhaling deeply as their meat cooked on the grill. He smiled at his female teammate, and gave her a good-natured chuckle. That depends, he said. Who are you talking about? Shikamaru sighed, seated opposite his best friend. Come on, Choji, I'm sure there's only one girl she'd be talking about like that, he grumbled, glancing wistfully out the window. It's Sakura, right? Ino glared. She's been getting far too cozy with Sasuke-kun, the Yamanaka heiress muttered, her eyes flashing. She ground her teeth. That human billboard, if she thinks that being on the same team is an excuse for them to act all lovey-dovey. Choji arched one of his eyebrows at this statement. Love-dovey, he said, side-eyeing Ino. Are we talking about the same Sakura, here? I've seen Em around the village a couple times, you know. She and Sasuke aren't exactly what I'd call mushy or ooey-gooey. Half the time I see them, those two are practically at each other's throats, Shikamaru concurred. Hardly a starstruck romance, if you ask me. Ino rolled her eyes. Boys, she muttered in apparent exasperation. Can't you two even read between the lines? Sakura and Sasuke-kun are flirting all the time. It's sickening. Flirting. Shikamaru parried, sounding disbelieving. He made a face. Geez. If that's what you think courtship is supposed to look like, then maybe I should just forego romance altogether. Yeah, Choji said, nodding. I'm with Shikamaru on this one. If that's what you call flirting. Ino scoffed. I'm surrounded by idiots, she muttered. You two don't know the first thing about romance, do you? She shook her head. Why, next I suppose you'll be saying you can't even tell Naruto and Hinata are an item. Shikamaru blinked. Wait, what? He said. Choji stared at Ino, looking similarly astonished. Those two? An item. Ino stared at the two, unwilling to believe that they could possibly be this oblivious. After a moment's thought, and the slowly dawning realization that, yes, her teammates really were that thick, she let out a miserable groan. I can't believe I'm supposed to work with you idiots. She bemoaned. Yeah, right back at you, Ino, Shikamaru muttered. Choji's attention shifted back to the meat on the grill. Well, enough talk, he said. Smells like lunch is ready. Ino scowled, but reluctantly grabbed her chopsticks. Shikamaru mentally debated the merits of competing with his teammates for the food versus just getting something out of the fridge once he got home. For his part, Asuma was greatly enjoying his impromptu restroom rendezvous with Kurenai. That's it for part 2. Thank you for watching and see you on the next video.